Aurora Brown and Intersectional Psychology acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout South Africa and their connections to land, water, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Indigenous people listening today. Intersectional Psychology, Season 3, Episode 4. Big Brother is still cis. Countering anti-gender attacks. Hosted by Aurora Brown and featuring special guest Clinical Psychologist Pierre Brouard. Content note: this episode references anti-gender movements and the concepts of hate crimes and hate speech. If you're unable to engage with these topics right now, you are welcome to skip this episode or come back to it when you feel better resourced. Hello, and welcome back to Intersectional Psychology, the podcast that explores psychology's role in promoting social justice. I'm your host, Aurora Brown. I'm a registered counsellor in Cape Town, South Africa. I'm glad you're here. Today we are continuing our series on the health of trans and gender diverse people with a discussion on how to counter anti-gender movements and disinformation and misinformation online, as well as how to protect your mental health online. My guest for today, who you'll hear more about in a moment, is Clinical Psychologist Pierre Brouard. We had some recording issues with the video portion of the last part of my interview with Pierre. I know it's almost becoming a running theme on the podcast, recording issues. I promise I am not repeating the same old mistakes every time. I am making new mistakes every time. Clearly, I am technologically challenged. What a thing to be known for. Sorry. So we do have audio recording, backup audio recording of that portion of the interview. So you will be able to listen to the entirety of my interview with Pierre, even if you can't watch all of it. So thanks again for being here. Let's get into my interview with Pierre. Queer psychology, but make it radical. I am excited to have as my guest today clinical psychologist Pierre Brouard. Pierre is also a research associate in the Center for Sexualities, AIDS and Gender at the University of Pretoria. He is an executive committee member for the Sexuality and Gender Division of the Psychological Society of South Africa, SAISA, and a board member of the Professional Association for Transgender Health South Africa, or PATHSA. So Pierre, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So what else can we know about you and your work?
I suppose if you looked at my working life, which started out in HIV work in the late 80s and then into the 90s, and then that kind of naturally evolved into work around sexualities and gender, and then into sort of transformation and diversity work. And then I would say in the last few years, perhaps more explicitly working in the trans space. The golden thread, I think, that links it all, if there is such a thing, is an interest in people who have, I suppose, marginal identities or who are on the receiving end of stigma, discrimination, and societal disapproval. I think I have a strong ethic in me around being upset and disturbed by unfairness. And I think that sort of this constant sense that society isn't inclusive for everybody, even though we have this amazing constitution in South Africa, on the ground, in reality, that isn't the case. And so I'm always interested in how do we bring more people into the circle of acceptance and access to rights and services, and just to be seen as a sort of as a part of the rich diversity of society. That is what sort of motivated me my whole working life. And so I suppose you could understand my work through the lens of how do we include people. And I realize as well that there's a kind of potential politics behind that statement too, because who gets to decide that we are the group that you should be included into? So it's also about challenging notions of center and periphery and trying to sort of play with the politics of power and who gets to decide who's in and who's out.
I love that. What are some of the most common presenting complaints related to mental health in the communities that you serve?
Well, so I've worked with queer or LGBTQIA plus mental health for decades, really. And the forms of exclusion and marginalization, I suppose you could say, are multi-layered, at the sense, first of all, of the sort of structures and systems that exclude people from achieving their rights. And even though, as I said earlier, we have a generous constitution and a generous legal framework, I think in reality, queer people's mental health is not taken seriously as a topic. There is not enough training in the curriculum of, say, healthcare providers generally in South Africa on that topic. There's not enough data gathering on queer people's mental health experiences and life. And even if you look at something like the census, for example, there's an opportunity there to capture information about queer people that I think has been missed historically. So at the level of systems and structures, I think there are forms of exclusion that mean that the experiences of many queer people when they engage, for example, with physical health and mental health services, they face stigma and discrimination at those levels. And there are very few consequences for those providers who act in those particular ways. And then I would say probably at the kind of social community level, the level of norms and values and community beliefs and practices. And I would include there communities of faith, communities that are organized around common cultural practices, and the general sort of area of media and sort of the spaces that inform attitudes and practices. You would see there that there are a lot of instances in which anti-queer sentiment is unproblematically generated and popularized. And even though we have a new hate crimes, hate speech act, it hasn't yet been properly enacted. And I think that the terms of the Papuda Act and the Equality Courts, I think that they have had limited success in addressing hate speech and hateful utterances there. And then I would say, I suppose at the interpersonal, familial level, you could argue that there's a lot of anti-queer sentiment that still persists in South Africa. And I don't think it's helpful to simply say it's just homophobia and transphobia for its own sake. I think often communities and individuals, perhaps I'm being generous here, genuinely struggle to understand different identities and ways of being. And they are the products of their own socialization, so they sort of uncritically might recreate some of those attitudes. I've just written a draft co-chapter in a book on conversion practices in Africa that affect young people. And my co-author and I pitched to the editors of this particular book the idea that we wanted to think about conversion practices, which are those practices that attempt to alter the sexual orientation or gender identity of a person, that parents who are often the main perpetrators of those practices, because those young people are in their care, and they might take their children to a healer or a church person or through a ritual or ranges of processes to try and make them unqueer in some way. We thought it was unhelpful to position those as just simply acts of malice or unkindness, but rather to position them within understandings of parenting as partly love, but also partly duty, and raising your child to be a member of the community that fits into that community. And if you believe your child won't fit in a sense, you're doing them a good service by trying to make them unqueer. I mean, of course, it's impossible to do that, and it is experienced by that person as incredibly othering and destructive to your sense of self and wellness, your mental and emotional wellness. But those parents are not just acting out of malice. We thought that framing might be helpful.
Big Brother is still cis. Not using the census to gather data on queer people also kind of makes us seem like a smaller group than we really are, or a smaller number than we really are. And it's much easier to dismiss and other a group that is seen as very marginal and very small. And then because of that, the people who are queer, also not all of us will speak out or come out because we feel like we're the only ones. And that then further reduces the visibility of the community. And the impacts that each of these things have on a queer person are compounded. Like you say, it's all layered.
In a way, we can distinguish between very clear, overt acts of violence, name calling, hitting, harming. But there is a kind of symbolic violence in silence and invisibility, which I think is what you're suggesting in your framing there, that when you're a young queer person and you have no frame of reference for your identity and your way of being, and that's partly because your parents can dominate your space, and the community you work in or live in can dominate your ideas. And so when you don't see representations that are healthy and open about people like yourself, you can literally feel as if you're the only queer in the village or the planet or the world. I mean, I suppose countering that is the idea that, well, the social media, internet space is another window into visibility. But even then, there is a lot of hatred on the social media space and misinformation. So you might find communities like yourself online, but you also might find a lot of harmful ideas, which can then threaten your own sense of well-being.
Absolutely. And it's always kind of a catch-22 because you'll see in the US, obviously it's good for the census to gather data on queer people and for us to be represented there. But on the other hand, if you look at places like the US, technology and databases are weaponized against immigrants or queer people and used to further identify them and punish them for their otherness.
The numbers question is interesting because I was a couple of years ago part of a team of people that ran a seminar series on the possibilities and pitfalls of including queer people in large social surveys. And one of the debates that we had in that series was, what if you do the numbers and you find out that the numbers of queer people are small? Then what that can be weaponized by anti-queer forces to say, why are we putting all our energy into this small group of people? And in a way, it enables a kind of punching down to that community. I think, which is why I love aspects of our own constitution, why living in a constitutional democracy feels important to me, is that the way that our laws and our constitution are framed is not a simple majoritarianism that operates in South Africa. We see South African society as being a mosaic of large numbers and small numbers and big identities and small identities. So in a way, it's not about just the largest number of people dominates. It's about how you find that delicate balancing act of all different kind of identities and practices. And I think the other thing that your comment made me think about is, particularly stimulated by your mention of the United States, is I think we're living in an unprecedented era around a kind of questioning of science and truthfulness. And that in a way, people are opting for their version of the truth and contesting established scientific method with new forms of evidence making, and weaponizing conservative think tanks and sometimes dodgy science, in the interests of a particular ideological point of view or struggle.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Platforms of harm, laws of hope. More and more social media platforms, including Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, have abandoned their commitments to fact-checking disinformation that you mentioned on their platforms. They're also now refusing to monitor and censor hate speech and bullying online. Most of these companies are headquartered in the US, where there is very limited legal and governmental desire to protect marginalized people. But like you say, South Africa does have much stricter hate speech laws and even our constitution, specifically bans discrimination against anyone. So I know you're not a legal scholar, but do users of these platforms here in South Africa have more legal protection than American users? Are these companies supposed to change their policies for people around the world to adhere to our laws?
Yeah. The thing is, the challenge, and I think you've articulated it really clearly, is that these large organizations, there's really very little ethical oversight, and they are pretty much able to do what they wish. And I think the rise of Trump and Trumpism is a feature we cannot ignore here, that there's a kind of fetishization of free speech that is happening in the United States. And that these kind of guardrails that were tentatively there in these big platforms are being eroded in the interests, I think, of a kind of anti-woke drive that is being pushed by the Trump government, that any attempt to restrict what people can say, what kind of language they can use, or attempts to make the world and language and policies and spaces more inclusive are seen as anti-American. They're seen as anti-freedom. And I think it's definitely had a knock-on effect in terms of these big platforms where increasingly terrible things are being said. And it's very difficult. I see sometimes on TikTok how content creators get bullied and harassed and devastated by the hate that is thrown at them. But I do think we in South Africa, we have laws that make it possible for people to then, even though some of those utterances are on those platforms, in terms of South African law, there are things that you can or cannot do. So, for example, I know there have been some recent high-profile cases, and some of those people are being taken to the Human Rights Commission, for example. These cases, often take their time through the processes of getting to a point or some kind of resolution. But I do think I'm quite proud of the fact that those things do exist, even though they're perhaps not as assertive or as powerful as they could be.
Receipts, resistance, and raising hell. Getting on to how we then look after ourselves online and how we can combat these hate speech and the disinformation that is out there. Earlier this year, PATHSA released a brief guide to dealing with anti-trans disinformation and intimidation specifically. I'm going to include a link to the guide in the show notes for this episode. Can you tell us a bit about what you were seeing that led you to create this document?
So I think that particularly the space around trans and gender diverse people in South Africa has become more fraught in the last few years. And I would say what we're seeing is the impact of the global anti-gender movement, and particularly in its American form. I'm sure your viewers/listeners are familiar with the anti-gender movement, but in brief, it's a belief, a pushback, I suppose, against what is called gender ideology, a term that was coined, I believe, by the Catholic Church some years ago. And this alleged gender ideology was putting forward ideas about women's equality, about women's rights to contraception and abortion, and also queer rights to gender self-expression and gender self-identity, and also even pushing back against things like comprehensive sexualities education in schools. So anything that was a kind of a progressive idea around shifting notions of who's in and who's out, going back to our previous conversation, and whose rights matter. Anything that was seen as an opposition to that was framed as gender ideology. And the anti-gender movement is trying to reinstate more traditional ideas about women and men and the place of LGBTQIA plus people in society. And in a way, it's really about reinforcing patriarchal interests and a particular idea of the family. And so we've seen those influences of those kinds of movements in South Africa, with small organizations starting up. People like Ingrid Lynch and others have done really good work in looking at the history of some of this work, including also Marion Stevens, have started to sort of document the different groupings in South Africa. Some of them predate the anti-gender movement, but they've, in a sense, seen this as an opportunity to be revived in their work and reinvigorated to put forward conservative ideas about family and women and queer people and young people. I'm not going to name organizations in South Africa. There's one particular one that's proving to be, I think, interested in litigation. We may touch on that shortly. I'm not going to name them because I think partly because I don't want to give them more airtime than they deserve, but secondly, also partly to protect myself and my own interests from being litigated against. But it's a small group of people with links to an American body, and their interest is in creating, I would say, discord in the trans organized space in South Africa. And they're pushing back against gender affirming care, particularly for young people. They're pushing back against the idea that young people could know that they're trans or gender diverse. And they're moving into the legal space to try and, I suppose, create a climate of intimidation and fear amongst practitioners who are working with gender affirming care, particularly for young people. And they're also entering into the public opinion space by releasing commentaries in national publications or writing commentaries for journal articles, for journals. And so what we're seeing, I would say, is a kind of attempt to disrupt and to create fear and anxiety and to create consternation and dismay and disarray in the trans space in South Africa. So that was some of the context for us, particularly in Path SA, to think about, well, what do we do? I mean, we're a small body of people. Our main focus is working with and supporting professionals working in this space. And of course, there are other role players like Gender Dynamics, for example, and others doing excellent work. But I suppose it was an attempt to say, let's punctuate this moment. Like, let's stop and say, hey, what's going on here? We're noticing something. And what are some of the things that you can do to think, to notice, and to act and to protect?
So, this guide that PATHSA developed contains useful information for several different audiences, including healthcare providers who are facing harassment, transgender and gender diverse people, allies, and activists who are facing transphobia and harassment, and also general online safety tips for basically anyone online. So if we start with gender affirming healthcare providers facing harassment, could you please give us some insight into the kind of harassment and challenges that providers are facing?
I think what we're seeing, I'm not going to again name names particularly, but we're seeing that I know of at least one provider of gender affirming care is facing legal action, essentially based on decision making around providing gender affirming care to young people. And we know that that is a space that's become really weaponized by the anti-trans, anti-gender movement, which is attempting to create, I would say, sufficient doubt around gender affirming care for minors in a way that in a way makes that care lack any form of credibility. And what we're seeing a kind of weaponization of science and the scientific method, and creating, I would say, and I'm sure maybe someone like Haley might have talked about this, an idea that we need a certain gold standard of evidence before being able to offer that kind of care to young people, when that gold standard is unachievable in terms of the ethics of doing that kind of research and the complexities of doing that kind of research, and also ignoring the fact that other forms of care towards young people are based on also a similar standard of evidence that gender-affirming care has at the moment. So we're seeing what is happening is that there's a kind of pushback against providers and implying that they're acting in ways that are unethical or against the oaths that they have taken as a medical doctor. And I am aware of at least one practitioner who's been reported to the Health Professions Council of South Africa in an attempt to create a kind of silencing and chilling effect. I think that those attempts are largely going to be unsuccessful because they're more mischief making than rooted in likelihood of succeeding. And so I'm also aware that there was an advisory released by the Health Professions Council of South Africa last year around the use of puberty pauses in young people, which is one of the treatment options around gender diverse young people. And although one is not being forced to stop use puberty pauses, what it does is starts to create sufficient doubt and sow the seeds of doubt. And so I think this is what is beginning to happen, is that practitioners are beginning to say, should I carry on working in this space, or is my work actually informed by the best science? And what if I'm being sued and I lose my rights to practice as a medical practitioner? What about reputational damage? So I think we're beginning to see, although the numbers are small, beginning to see a sense of anxiety beginning to filter out into that space. Yeah, I think that is what we are noticing in terms of providers of gender-affirming care, is that there's this general climate of anxiety and uncertainty and fear that's beginning to be generated. So if you look at the guideline that we wrote, we're not offering specific legal advice about what one can do, but it's more about stepping back, making a reasonable assessment of the risk. And I would say that includes talking to a legal practitioner, talking to the ethics bodies that govern your practice, talking to your peers who may be doing the same kind of work, reaching out to organizations like Path SA to say, how can you assist us in thinking this through? So that's definitely one of the things that we talk about in the guideline. And then the importance of documenting everything that one does in one's work. That is, I mean, obviously standard medical practice, but in this instance, it's even more important that any decision making, for example, around gender affirming care for young people is strictly done by the book, and that it's a detailed, lengthy process and involves as much consultation as possible. In fact, that's always been the standard of care. But what I think these anti-trans forces do is they start to create doubts. And part of what we wanted to do with the guideline was to say, trust yourself, trust your instincts, trust the science, trust the knowledge, speak to the community.
And that harassment isn't just causing providers to kind of step away or pull out of providing gender affirming healthcare. It also is prohibitive to other providers or newly trained providers stepping into the field. And like you say, I think, or what I'm extrapolating from what you're saying, is that a lot of this doubt around gender affirming healthcare and the risks associated with it ignores the risks of not providing care at all.
I think what is disconcerting to me, and I think shows up the true intentions of a lot of these anti-gender forces and people, is that they frame themselves as being concerned about the person. But I don't see that energy translating into caring for the mental health of young people.
Exactly. And when Tembi was on, we spoke about how the counseling that they are suggesting instead of gender affirming healthcare is more akin to a conversion practice than to actual therapy. Don't feed the trolls, but don't starve yourself either. So, what should providers know about participating in online spaces?
When we wrote the guidelines, we did distinguish between providers and, in a sense, the trans or gender diverse person or the ally themselves. But there is obviously a strong overlap between general forms of carefulness. But certainly for professional people, one can uh, separate out one's professional profile from maybe more personal stuff that you want to do. So that is one layer of protection, I think, that you can offer. And then there are sort of general safety mechanisms around working online, checking security settings on the platforms that you use to make them the highest possible, making sure that your passwords are safe and protected, using things like double authentication systems. You need a password and maybe a PIN code to access certain platforms or for people to get to you. Platforms like WhatsApp have options where your messages can disappear or even images can be sent for a short period of time. If you belong to groups on WhatsApp, there are moderator functions about keeping people out. I know WhatsApp also has limits on how many times you can forward something, for example. So that can stop the trolls from sending out nasty stuff to a whole swathe of people. So, and I think also choosing your battles is probably another area that's important to think about in terms of online protection broadly, because that's also partly about protecting yourself. I mean, auto-critique here is that I don't always succeed myself, is that I engage another troll on TikTok and I think afterwards, why did you do that? And sometimes it might be better to work with like-minded people, find your community, than trying to tackle on the transphobes where they just pile on and then their supporters pile on, leaving you feeling very isolated. So, and again, I think that leads me also to the kind of self-care aspect of it, to monitor yourself and your consumption of online material. Many of us can get addicted to scrolling, doom scrolling for hours, or going down rabbit holes of negativity. And honestly, my biggest advice would be just pull back from that, to have a digital detox, try and give yourself a break, do things that are not online, going out into nature and the world, seeing friends, doing stuff that is affirming, exercise, all the usual things that we know about but struggle to do sometimes.
It's me, Aurora. Please excuse me interrupting my own podcast. I'm just here to say that I will never include third-party ads on intersectional psychology, which is great because it means that you can be sure all the mental health information and content shared here is free from corporate influence and bias. However, it also means that this podcast will only be made possible by support from you, the listener. So if you enjoy this podcast or find value in it, please consider joining my Patreon, or Matreon rather, for as little as $3 per month. Your contributions will be used to improve this podcast, to cover the production costs to research, write, record, and edit each episode, and to host our guests. In return, you'll get exclusive Patreon benefits like bonus episodes, additional guided mindfulness recordings, early access to new episodes, extended episodes and outtakes, group discussions, and more. So just go to patreon.com and search for Intersectional Psychology. Thanks, and back to Intersectional Psychology. Can you tell us more about how the suggestions for trans and gender diverse people and allies and activists facing transphobia and harassment, how does this differ from the advice for providers?
The ideas that I've just articulated do cross over between providers and the kind of average online user who could be trans or an ally. Most difficult aspects, and I guess I need to sort of speak about my own positionality here, which I haven't really yet in this discussion, is around the fact that I'm not trans, but I'm also a little bit gender questioning in my own worldview, and I find the categories and labels around gender often very unhelpful, and have had many experiences of being misgendered in the world, even today with being bald and having a grey beard. I do regularly get a kind of peripheral misgendering, which is out of the corner of the eye. Someone reads me as feminine, and then will call me ma'am, and then reverts to sir in a flurry of embarrassment and shame, which is in itself a whole interesting topic to discuss. So, in a sense, I have an interest in understanding the world through the lens of someone who might face scrutiny on the basis of their gender identity or presentation. So I think for me, it's about protecting oneself as the first and foremost important thing. That it can be incredibly, I think, devastating to face harassment and harm and misnaming and dead naming and misgendering, that is, particularly when it's deliberately done. I see that a lot on social media platforms when the trans person or sometimes intersex person is deliberately misgendered by a troll. I think as a gay person, I've learned to develop certain kind of protective mechanisms, but I still think some of those arrows get through, whether we like it or not. So I would say the first thing is really about protecting your own well-being, your own psychological and spiritual well-being. And that can mean making very clear decisions about who you will or will not take on. And there's no shame in disengaging from an encounter or leaving a platform or choosing not to take somebody on. But I think if it matters to you and you feeling strong in that moment, it can be strategic to push back in ways that assert yourself, because there is also sometimes a value and a power in standing up to a bully and saying, I refuse to let you speak to me that way, or I don't take on your transphobia. It says more about you than it does about me. So if one can do that in ways that are self-affirming and setting a boundary and assertive, I think that can be an incredibly empowering thing to do. But not everybody, I think, is able to do that, or is able maybe to do that on a particular day. And that is where I think bringing in an ally can be important. Get your troops, tell other people who will then engage with that person. In the South African context, I would say invoking our PAPUDA Acts, Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act, because people are accountable for online hate speech in terms of that act and in the forthcoming Hate Crimes, Hate Speech Act. So I think if someone is, for example, speaking on behalf of a professional body or a business, and then one can take them on from that point of view in terms of whether that is something that their corporate image allows for. For example, if someone is speaking in their official capacity as part of an organization. So I would say those are some of the ideas that I have. It's not always easy to do that, I would concede. But I think it is important to reach out to your community, find your safety nets, and strategically sometimes to withdraw to a safe space for yourself.
WhatsApp isn't your therapist, and other online survival truths. The internet, and especially social media, is becoming a scarier place every day for marginalized people. Is there anything else that any other measures that you would like to advise on to protect ourselves online?
For better or for worse, the internet and that space is with us. And like all great technological advancements, they come with their advantages and the unintended consequences. And it is a bit like riding a monster wave, and it's exhilarating but terrifying at the same time. And I do think I have the advantage, even over someone like you, is that I'm old. And I grew up before everything, before television, before internet, before computers, before ATMs, before social media. So I know what a life was like before all of this. I didn't have, and I think the challenge is that young people are growing up with their brains being co-wired with the internet social media space, and they don't have the wisdom and the capacity to see what it is doing to them. And what you already, I don't know if you've noticed this, but a number of countries around the world, notably Australia, are introducing legislation to not allow young people to have cell phones, and with certain kinds of cell phones up to a certain age. Which, I mean, I hate to sound like a Luddite, but I'm kind of support that, because I think it's a tool that you don't understand and can't manage and protect yourself from. So I think certainly from a parent point of view is protecting one's kids from access to social media too early. But otherwise, finding ways to take spaces from the digital world would be the biggest single thing that I could recommend. But it's difficult, God knows how many of us are out with a bunch of friends, 3/4 of the crowd are on their phones, in the interest of documenting the event. But, whatever happened to just talking to each other?
Absolutely. I actually agree with you 100% about, limiting smartphones for up to a certain age. So it sometimes feels like we need to be online in order to be real in the world. And with everything happening, as activists, we also feel like we have a duty to be aware of what is going on in the world. That makes disconnecting or taking a break from the media difficult. Do you have tips that could help us disconnect?
I also recognize that we all have different needs and different ways of connecting in the world. So for some people, connecting person to person can work. Other people may not be so good in the human space and the online world feel safer for them. So to lose that can feel quite devastating. I'm thinking about the young person you were mentioning, that if you're not online, it can feel as if you don't exist, that you've ceased to be real because you haven't got that connection or that presence. But I would say it is about looking around you and seeing who are the people that are your people, that are people that make you feel affirmed, that make you feel seen, connected, valued. And that could be, it could be your biological family, your chosen family. It could be a support group. It could be an interest group, a hobby group, walking, hiking, swimming, yoga, karate. Am I revealing myself to be middle class here? I don't know. But yeah, I mean, for me, being out walking in the world, in nature, is a no-brainer, because it sort of literally earths you in a different way. So I would say finding interests that are outside of the online space would be a first prize. But I recognize that for a lot of people, that is the safest space for them. The world out there isn't always so accepting or easy to be in. That is an unfortunate reality. The old-fashioned world of books and music, for me, listening to music that is of a particular emotional tone takes me to places that are interesting and restful and soothing. There are online spaces that are trans-specific or inclusive in various ways. So it's also about looking for those online worlds that are safe, that are moderated. I would say would be important things to think about as well.
Thank you. I love those tips. Now, the only social media or messaging platform that is specifically named in the guide is WhatsApp. Many of us use WhatsApp to maintain our most intimate relationships, so we just kind of assume or maybe hope and pray that it is a safe space. What would you like to share with us about using WhatsApp?
The main advice is do your homework. You get invited to join groups that you don't know. So be careful about which groups you join. Make sure that the groups are moderated. Some groups have specifications or settings where only the admins can post. That's often a very important safeguard against people mouthing off things that are transphobic or hateful. So I'd say choose your company carefully in terms of which WhatsApp groups you will join. And maybe do a cleanse every now and again of your WhatsApp groups that you've joined. And maybe you could say, well, this one isn't serving me, or I'm going to take a break. I find muting notifications very helpful, because you can end up being pinged all day and all night. Personally, I put my phone on silent at night, so I'm not disturbed by any messaging or notification that comes through to me.
Yes, doing your homework is excellent advice. But also, the size of the group really makes a difference. The larger a group gets, the more opportunity there is for bad actors. I've been in groups that are supposed to be safe spaces for, say, queer or gender diverse people, but then there are elements of racism that crop up in those spaces. So, looking at it through this intersectional lens as well, a group might be safe for one particular marginalized group, but not for another. And then, do you even want to be a part of such a group if it's not going to accept everyone?
Totally. I mean, yeah, I think, sorry to interrupt you there. I think in the guide, we do mention intersectionality as an important philosophy and approach to think through, is that the world isn't necessarily safe with people who you think are your people, because they may be, as you say, racist, xenophobic, and all other kinds of forms of othering. So, yeah, really about finding your people within your people, maybe one strategy.
Exactly. I love that phrase. Your people within your people. Finding your people. Flipping the script. With all the discrimination and hatred towards us being so ubiquitous and loud online, it really helps to put out more positive narratives about trans and gender diverse people, just to balance it out. But as we've discussed, engaging in those spaces is challenging. What tips do you have for those of us who do want to effectively challenge the prevailing narratives online and put out more positive narratives?
I would say, find good sources of information and good content creators that know what they're talking about and who are authoritative. I mean, of course, in a sense, we're all authorities in our own lives. So for example, for me, I consciously follow trans and gender diverse content creators online because I think, well, if someone who is a neuroscientist and trans, then that's really a double win because they are not only speaking out of the trans experience, but they've also studied and have that sort of level of knowledge behind them. So I think for me, finding authoritative sources, people from within those communities who could also add other layers of expertise to their knowledge. And boost those content creators, like them, follow them, share them, is a way of spreading the love and pushing back against the hate. And also for me, stepping in for content creators who are diverse and who are then exposed to hate is to step into the comment space and say, thank you for your sharing, for your wisdom, or what your vulnerability, I think is an important act of allyship. In the guide, we may mention LinkedIn, I'm not sure, which is a so-called more professional platform. I mean, LinkedIn is interesting because I think it's gone through different kinds of iterations. In its early years, I got quite boring, but I've found it's become a more, slightly more activist-y space at times around gender or around race, around privilege, around coloniality. So I've been interested to find that phenomenon emerging. But if you are going to work in more professional, so-called professional workplace spaces, again, it's about putting your own best foot forward in terms of making sure that your own profile looks professional. We can debate professionalism because it could be a kind of I suppose, a middle-class idea. Whose idea of professionalism is it another form of gatekeeping? But nevertheless, I suppose it's horses for courses, is that phrase. Put that part of you out that works on a particular platform would be, I think, one suggestion that stands out for me.
Yes, I've seen LinkedIn being a space for people to get out longer form ideas or thought leadership, or even putting out academic content without a paywall. But I saw, I think last week, that LinkedIn is also pulling back from their commitment to content moderation now. So I guess we need to be mindful of our safety wherever we are online.
That's disappointing. Disappointing.
It is very much so. It feels like all the dominoes are falling one by one. As we wind up this episode, would you like to share what is on the horizon for you?
Yeah, one project that I would like to talk about is a project I'm running with the Sexuality and Gender Division of SISA. It's on conversion practices, and it actually comes to an end this month. It's been going for about a year, and we've developed a guideline for mental health practitioners working with survivors of conversion practices across the continent. So it's had a launch, sort of in its final stages of tweaking, but that will be available soon. But what we're developing as a companion to that is an online e-learning course aimed primarily at mental health practitioners, but of course it will probably take on a life of its own to then understand and learn techniques and skills around working with those survivors. So for me, that's been quite an exciting project, and one that I'm quite proud of, because I think that the guideline and the toolkit will be an incredible resource for the continent.
That's wonderful. Thanks for sharing that. We need more and more trauma-informed approaches to all sorts of mental health challenges and experiences, especially in the queer space. Thank you so much to Pierre for all of his work and for being so generous with his time. And thank you to you, the listener, for being here, for continuing to show up for this community and for this podcast. I appreciate you. Thank you for listening to Intersectional Psychology. Please follow or subscribe to the podcast to get every episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review Intersectional Psychology in your preferred app. It really helps other people find the podcast. This episode of Intersectional Psychology was researched, written, recorded, and edited by me, Aurora Brown. For a transcript of this episode, please see the link in the show notes on your podcast app or go to intersectionalpsychology.com. You can also check the website or the show notes for a full list of references for this episode. A video of this episode with closed captions is available on youtube.com/@intersectionalpsychology. To support this podcast and get access to bonus content, including additional episodes and interviews, as well as more guided mindfulness sessions, please go to patreon.com/intersectionalpsychology. You can also chat with me on Blue Sky at intersectpsych.bsky.social and Instagram, Facebook, or TikTok at Intersectional Psychology. But mostly Blue Sky. Aurora Brown and Intersectional Psychology are committed to the Cite Black Women praxis. All episodes of Intersectional Psychology are for educational purposes only and are not intended to be a substitute for professional mental health advice, diagnosis, or treatment. I, Aurora Brown, am not able to answer specific questions about individual situations. Always seek the advice of your health provider with any questions you may have regarding a mental health condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard or seen on this podcast. If you think you need immediate assistance, please call your local emergency number or any mental health crisis hotline. Everyone deserves good mental health.